Welcome, everyone. Our Cybersecurity Days 2021 theme is Securing Your Digital Life. And we know that ransomware is top of everyone's mind. It was a great session to learn about an attack from our keynote, Lisa Soto. Our next speaker, Sean Henry, will help us understand ransomware and other threats in our landscape today and your role in it. Sean serves as president of CrowdStrike Services, leading a world-class team of cybersecurity professionals in investigating and mitigating targeted attacks on corporate and government networks globally. He also serves as chief security officer and oversees all security aspects of global CrowdStrike facilities, personnel, executive protection, and corporate events. Sean joined CrowdStrike in 2012 after retiring from the FBI, where he oversaw half of the Bureau's investigative operations, including all FBI critical incident response to major investigations and disasters. Sean lectures at leading universities and is a faculty member at the National Association of Corporate Directors. He serves as a keynote speaker at major cybersecurity conferences around the world and is regularly interviewed on cybersecurity issues by major broadcast, cable, online, and print media. So welcome, Sean. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here and appreciate the opportunity to chat with this audience.
So, Sean, can you give us a state of play of the ransomware landscape today and the trends and attacks, particularly over the last year?
Yeah, I think this is absolutely something that's front of mind for so many organizations. I do deal with the C-suite and boards for major corporations, and we've seen this incredible increase over the last couple of years, particularly partially because we see this, what I call the expansion of the landscape, the target space continuing to get bigger and bigger as more organizations kind of open up their aperture. They're putting more devices online. We've got the whole work from home because of COVID. So the target space has gotten bigger. But probably most importantly, I think what we've seen is adversaries who recognize that their return on their investment, which is somewhat limited compared to some of the other schemes, fraudulent schemes or other hacking schemes they're involved in, that the return on investment for ransomware is substantially higher. So we're seeing organizations that are being hit by organized crime groups, primarily from the former Soviet Union. Think of places like Russia, Ukraine, Belarus. But we're also seeing movement from groups out of Africa, Latin America, Asia, because of the significant financial returns to these groups. So, you've got kind of this coming together of increased target space, increased adversaries, more vulnerable software that's being exploited, and it's turned into this incredible challenge for enterprises around the globe to keep their systems up and running because this ransomware is so disruptive to everything they do.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you feel that adversaries are getting more arrogant? And if so, what's driving that?
Yeah, that word is very interesting, arrogance. I think that, in the physical world, I compare the physical world and the digital world quite often because I think there are actually more similarities than there are differences. And in the physical world, when you implement deterrence, law enforcement actions, stiff penalties and jail terms for people who were caught doing something illegal, robbing a bank, some type of a violent crime, drug dealing. I think when the penalties are high and severe, that it deters certain people from engaging in that type of illegal activity. In the digital world, when I talk about the arrogance of these actors, they don't really care if you know who they are because they're protected in many cases. In other words, the long arm of the law enforcement, whether it be from the US or some other Western nation, does not reach into many of the countries where these actors are emanating from. So they're bulletproof in many ways. So they do have this arrogance. They know in many cases that they've been identified. We know who they are. The government knows who they are in many cases, but they're not able to reach out and touch them without the cooperation of the host government where these people reside. So again, no opportunity to really deter or impact these actors, and they will continue to attack relentlessly until you can actually stop them physically from launching those attacks.
Yeah, absolutely. So what have you learned from and CrowdStrike learned from investigating ransomware attacks that can help inform decisions about when we or others have to negotiate with these actors?
Great question. I think there's a lot that we've learned over the last couple of years. Again, I think there are a lot of similarities between the physical world and the digital world. And when I think about ransomware and the way these actors are attacking organizations uninterrupted, I think that we are not in a position to prevent these types of attacks. We're not in a position from a government perspective, unless you can actually stop the actors, which means that the private sector has to implement capabilities, technology, policies and processes to allow them to detect and disrupt the attacks on their own networks. We can't rely on the government. Again, in the physical world, bank robbers, we rely on police officers to stop the bank robbers. Certainly, the banks put in their defensive posture. They might have, bandit barriers, and they might have a guard, but they're really relying on the police to identify and stop these attackers. We cannot do that in ransomware. Organizations have to invest in their technology and their capabilities to protect themselves. The risk is so high if they don't do it. The number of companies that have been taken offline for weeks or months is substantial. So companies really have to better prepare and better invest in their capabilities.
Yeah. So kind of tying into that, then how can leaders create a culture where cybersecurity is an engine for innovation to do that?
I think that leadership is a term that is either misunderstood or not taken seriously enough by organizations. I can tell you that in the many cases, and this goes back to my time in the FBI, so I'm talking about going back more than 20 years now, where I've seen the successful remediation or the successful disruption or the successful defense of networks. There was strong leadership. And conversely, where I've seen failure, it's because there was poor leadership in the overwhelming majority of cases. And what I mean by that is organizations that have a sense of urgency, organizations that take this seriously. They have a sense of responsibility. They are thinking strategically. They're demonstrating leadership characteristics, and they're making sure that this is something that's prioritized. It's important. The defense of the network is important to them. And when you've got leadership that's doing that, and I'm talking about, from the CEO down or the board down, when the leader is setting the tone, it changes the culture of the organization. I really believe in this security first posture, that the risk is so high, and in many cases it may be existential, that if the leadership doesn't identify that risk, practice safe practices, promote safe practices, encourage people to hold the bar high, then companies are going to suffer. So leadership absolutely has the ability to change people's way of thinking, to encourage people and to motivate people to take this seriously, to motivate the tech teams to innovate and to invest their time and energy into making the network a safer place, and by way of that, the entire infrastructure a safer place. If we had that mindset across every organization, across every company, globally, we would have a far less challenging problem than we have right now. But the fact is, we're seeing the weak being culled from the herd.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. It's critical. So people tend to forget about cyber when they're speaking to the resiliency of a business. So why is that backwards?
I think that many organizations, when I think about cyber, a digital attack, a virtual attack, I think that for a lot of people, it's not real, right? In the physical world, you can see the impact of a security failure. Where either somebody breaks in and steals something of value, or there's some type of a violent act because there was a failure in security. It's very visible, and that resonates with people. I think that in the digital world, when you've got adversaries that are exfiltrating data, that it's hard to get your arms around that for many people. They don't understand or appreciate the risk. Something like ransomware has started to change that. So we are seeing some movement, right? With ransomware, when the hospital system is shut down and they have to cancel surgeries for 3 weeks, or when you go to your local municipality and you can't get a permit to do a building project, or you can't get a driver's license because the systems have been shut down for weeks at a time, that now starts to resonate with people because they can see and feel the impact. So that's starting to change right now. Because people are starting to appreciate it. But I think resiliency has to start with cyber, because cyber is all things, right? Even your physical doors, your alarms, your gates are controlled by computers now. So if you're not focusing on the cyber aspect first, you can't even focus on the physical side of things in many cases. So I think that people are starting to get a greater appreciation because they're starting to see and feel the impact of these attacks. And I think that's a good thing in a way, that they're starting to pay better attention.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I think that the key there is that bit of the cyber is now starting to bleed into the reality and the physical, right? So when you can't get your ID anymore, that's a physical thing that you're challenged with.
And
right?
there's absolutely a merger, this interaction now between the physical world and the virtual world. They are coming together. Absolutely. We're seeing that in many, many ways. And that's why it's becoming ingrained in people's psyche. They're starting to see it. They're starting to feel it. And there's also this generational change, right? There are people my age who, computers were something you got involved in high school or in college. And there's this whole, these digital natives that grew up with this, and it's part of their life. They're operating an iPad or a device, at 5 years old, and it's a way of life, and they absolutely see it. So as we see kind of this transition, as people mature, as people kind of age out, we're going to see more and more people adopt that culture.
Yeah, absolutely. So shifting just a little bit, I know you offer guidance to lots of boards and C-suite personnel. Can you give us some insight into what that looks like?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the point we made earlier about leadership. I think that companies have a responsibility. They have a responsibility. First of all, corporately, they have a responsibility to the community. They have a responsibility to be good corporate citizens. The same way, we talk about things like climate change or social issues, that companies have a responsibility. I think as it relates to cybersecurity, they also have a responsibility. Certainly, it's quite obvious they have a legal responsibility and a civil responsibility to their shareholders, to their investors, et cetera. But I think they've got that broader responsibility to the community, and that requires them to pay attention to this and to prioritize this. So when I engage with boards, I really talk to them about what the business risk is. What does this mean to their company? And what does this mean more broadly to critical infrastructure, and why they have a role to play? And that really gets their attention. I think many times boards, oftentimes they're older folks that have been around a while. They're not the digital natives, but they're more digital immigrants. They see, they don't have a full appreciation. So that's the first part. Beyond that, it's really talking to them about the need to invest in their people, the need to invest in technology, the requirement for them to prioritize and pay attention to this, and to have that sense of urgency, which is quite important. And I know when they pay attention that the CISO and the information security specialists, and more broadly, all the different business units, they start to pay attention because, again, the leader sets the pace for the rest of the pack. And when they're paying attention, they're asking informed questions, they're challenging people, they're holding people accountable and responsible. It absolutely changes the entire culture of the organization. So I like the opportunity to talk to boards because I think it can absolutely have a significant impact on the direction a company takes.
Yeah, I agree. Do you feel like, as kind of a follow up to that, in general, do you feel like boards are starting to get it and starting to go in that direction related to cyber and that understanding?
They absolutely are. That was not the case 5 years ago. They would read in a magazine or online or see on the news a company had 5 million credit cards stolen, or a university lost 1 million usernames and passwords due to a hack. And again, it just didn't resonate with them because maybe they're not in the retail business, so they don't really deal with credit cards. They're in the manufacturing business, or usernames and passwords. It doesn't connect with them. But now seeing, people standing online for 40 minutes because the Colonial Pipeline was shut down, for a protracted period of time. Wow, that makes sense. Or, JBL gets hit and, we can't sell hot dogs and hamburgers over the holiday because their manufacturing plant is shut down or taken offline because of a ransomware attack. Now that starts to hit people. The next thing we'll see is when the electric power grid goes down for a period of time, or we see, water treatment facilities that are impacted and people have to boil water. These things have actually happened. They haven't gotten a lot of attention. They've happened in pockets. But when you start to see those types of things, people are absolutely paying attention.
Yeah, again, it goes back to that the merging of the two worlds, right? The physical and the cyber. So yeah, absolutely. So as someone who has crossed from working in the public sector to the private, what observations from both of those environments are important to share with our attendees?
Well, I had a 24-year career in the FBI, and it's something I'm very proud of. I felt like I was making a difference, like many of the women and men who serve in the military or in the government. It really is about the mission and trying to make things a better place, make the world or the country a better place. And I appreciated that. When I transitioned over to CrowdStrike almost 10 years ago, I felt like I still had the opportunity to contribute to the mission and add value, that similarly to what I was doing in the government, I could help companies be safer. And by using our technology and our expertise, we could help thwart some of these attacks and help protect industry and organizations around the globe. What I've learned is that while there are similarities between public and private, there are some pretty stark differences. And I learned early on that the government, as much as we've got folks that are sacrificing every single day in this space related to cybersecurity, their ability to impact and protect critical infrastructure is somewhat limited. In the physical world, if there was an opposing military flying jet fighters into U.S. airspace, we know what the response would be, right? We'd scramble jets and there'd be a phone call from the president or somebody in the White House to a head of state saying, you can't do that again, or this is what the repercussions will be. Or if there was a foreign army that posed a threat to U.S. forces, what that response would look like. We know what that looks like because we've seen it for decades. In this space, it's very, very different. And we see malware, right? Digital tools, weapons that are being launched every single day, millions of times a day, and they are landing in the U.S. commercial space and on U.S. networks, and they are not being filtered out by the government. And that's just a world we're not used to. So the government doesn't have the ability to protect those people. They don't have the ability to protect us. Therefore, we are responsible for protecting ourselves. And I can tell you, I've got people, young men and women, that are fighting literally on the networks with military officers, foreign intelligence officers from nation states every single day to protect and they're not military trained. They're certainly trained and they're experts in what they do, but they're fighting military units in many cases, as well as organized crime groups that are substantially funded because they're making hundreds of millions of dollars and they're investing in themselves. So that's a very unusual place to be, where the private sector is defending against nation state adversaries and militarily trained actors. That's a very interesting place. So it's an important mission. There need to be some changes going forward on how the government better protects the private sector through deterrence acts that they can take. But for right now, the big difference is the government doesn't have the capacity, the authorities, and in many cases, the expertise to protect the private sector. The private sector has to do it themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. So ransomware continues to be a huge issue and making headlines on a regular cadence. What would your guidance be to organizations on best practices they should implement to help with their cyber posture?
Well, you don't want to wait for a ransomware attack to occur to start thinking about it, because once it happens, you're in a bad way. Once the network gets hit, the encryption tools impact the environment. You've lost the ability to respond in most cases. So the key to ransomware and quite honestly to any type of malware attack, any type of attack we've seen adversaries participate in, is in prevention and being proactive. So we've got this philosophy of defense in depth where you've got to have multiple layers of security, right? Strong usernames and passwords, MFA. You've got to have IDS and IPS and firewalls and encryption. You've got to have segmented networks. There's a whole host of things that are best practices for defense in depth. But beyond that, organizations have to be proactive. They've got to be threat hunting, looking in their environment 24/7, using the right technology and using capable threat hunters. You've got to still have human beings, as important as technology is to weed out the anomalous or the anomalies rather. You need to have human beings that are looking at the results of that hunting. And you need to be testing your environment regularly. This is not, it's not like you go to the doctor once a year and you get a checkup and you're good until next year. This is absolutely 24/7. And much of it can be automated, but you still need human beings who have the skill set and the expertise, who've seen these attacks, who understand the emerging threats that actors are using. They understand who the actors are, their tactics and techniques. So being proactive, testing, doing things like tabletops, doing things like red teaming, penetration testing, constantly evaluating, probing your enterprise, because you want to find the vulnerability before they do. Because if they find it before you do, you're going to be in a world of hurt. So, that's probably the most important piece here. It's about being proactive, having that sense of, this is really important and we need to pay attention. I'll just add that we still see the adversaries using the least amount of effort that they can in order to obtain their objectives. In other words, if they can gain access to the network through a standard phish, which we see all the time, it's just a standard phish. Somebody clicks on an email or they hit a link that takes them to a malicious site where code is downloaded. They're going to do that rather than using a 0-day, which is a lot more effort. And by using a 0-day, you're potentially losing the ability to use it in the future. And that's very costly and expensive to the adversaries. They're going to use the area of least resistance, which means much of what they're doing is preventable if we're investing in things like patching and taking care of identified vulnerabilities. And that, the fact that organizations are still failing over and over again because of the inability to patch known vulnerabilities, that's a self-inflicted wound, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that basic hygiene is something that's just got to always be taken care of. So, yeah, I would agree. So What should, we have a pretty big hospital here in the Wexner Medical Center. What should hospital systems be aware of when it comes to the rise in destructive and disruptive attacks like ransomware, and how can they prevent becoming a victim?
I think hospitals, first of all, need to recognize that they are targets. I can tell you that in my experience, although this is changing, thankfully, but if you'd asked me 3 years ago, the healthcare sector was the least prepared in this space, based on my experience and working across every single sector, right? The financial services sector historically has been the best prepared. They've invested the most. They recognize the ROI. They recognize the risk. Years ago, they did, and they've invested. And healthcare, not so much. That's starting to change because of ransomware, because we've seen so many hospitals taken offline. We had several months ago, probably the first death that's been attributed to a cyber attack with a woman in Germany, because the hospital was hit with ransomware. They canceled surgeries. She was being transferred to another facility and died along the way. So people are starting to recognize the risk. I talked to a big hospital just yesterday. I met with the CISO there, and they're paying attention to this. And what I said to that hospital, and I'll say here to the audience, is you need to see yourself as a victim. And really, the methodology is no more different than what other organizations need to do. There are some differences. There are things like IoT in a hospital that might be more prevalent than in other areas like financial services. And you've got to ensure that you're protecting against that. The adversaries are looking for the easiest way in. And if they can compromise an IoT device and then move laterally through the environment to get to their objectives, they're going to do it. So you've got to be paying attention to that. I think hospitals, they need to recognize, the most important thing as it relates to a hospital, I think, is patient care. That's the top priority. And I think that when you think about cybersecurity, you have to attach those two things. That if the hospital is shut down, and because we don't have access to any of the data we need, we can't do surgeries, or we can't see patients, or we can't service our constituency, then patient care is going to suffer. So if you actually attach those two things, you recognize that this is an important objective for the hospital and healthcare, and you need to invest in it. And I think that healthcare organizations are starting to see that. I think they're recognizing what the risks are. They're aware of the impact, and they're making changes. And that's something I'm happy to see. I'm sorry it took so many ransomware attacks to make that happen, but I'm glad to see the changes being made in this sector, because it's such an important part of our society to have good healthcare systems. And when bad actors take those systems down, it's a tragedy for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's something that we've recognized for a while, and it's one of the main reasons why we went into partnership with CrowdStrike. So yeah. So a couple more questions, real quick. What does cybersecurity mean to you?
I think cybersecurity to me is now just an ordinary way of life. All right. Again, going back to the physical world. We live in a changing environment, and when you're walking in certain areas, you need to be aware of your environment, right? You've got to, make sure you walk in a lighted area. Maybe when you leave at night, you walk with somebody, so you've got another set of eyes with you. It's just the world that we live in. You've got to be much more aware and responsive. We've got to lock our doors, because that's the world we live in. So we have to adapt to that. And I think when I think about cybersecurity, it's the same thing. 20 years ago, people didn't think about getting online when we first saw the retail movement to online. And then there were denial of service attacks, and then there were theft of PII, and then there were now we've moved into ransomware. The dynamic is changing, and we have to adapt to that, rather. And I think that's just where we live. That security has to be ingrained. Cybersecurity needs to be a part of our daily lives. We need to be teaching kids early on about the dangers. that people you're talking to online might not be who you think they are, that sharing information, as much as many people want to be open, might not be the best idea from a security perspective. Maybe you need to be a little more cautious in what you're sharing and how you're sharing it, because it might impact you down the road. I think it's something that has to be taught early on, and we have to adapt to the world that we're living in, which unfortunately is a lot more dangerous than it probably was 50 years ago. And as human beings, we have to adapt. As a society, we have to adapt. And I think that if we're paying attention, we can go a long way to maintaining the value of the network, and still have a safety posture.
Yeah, I would agree. Adaptability and flexibility. Absolutely. So one last thing, what are some things that you wish technologists can do to prepare themselves for the ever complex threat landscape we face?
I think technologists still, when products are being manufactured, as new technology is being developed, I still think security is an afterthought. And when people are manufacturing new devices, they're thinking about it from a business perspective as it relates to sellability of products, and they're building in features and functionality because it adds to more sales, and they're not thinking about security at all in many cases, and that means that they're putting insecure infrastructure, software and or hardware into the environment that can be exploited. And I can tell you that the adversaries are looking every time something goes onto the network, they're looking for a way to exploit it. So if it's not being manufactured, if it's not being designed, if it's not being engineered with security as a priority, then it's going to be exploited. And I think that that's something that we as consumers can start to demand. I think that, there are certain software companies that continuously every single day are putting out patches because their software is vulnerable, and they're not investing the time or the energy, or they're not taking it seriously. In my opinion, they're not taking the security seriously. And when we see products, I think it's a differentiator for some companies. It will be if we as consumers demand security. I think if we bought a car, and you bought the car and airbags and seatbelts were optional, anti-lock brakes were optional, they're not being built in, or it's not even considered in the engineering. I think people see safety when you're driving a car as an important feature, and they make purchase decisions based on the safety of the vehicles. And I think if we start to do that with hardware and software, technological devices, I think it can be a differentiator for companies, and that will lead to more sales. So I'd like to see technologists and business leaders starting to think about that as an important component of the products they're developing. Because again, going back to my original premise, you need to be good corporate citizens. And if you're thinking, as you should be, about things like climate change and global warming and societal issues, broad societal issues that impact our citizens, then the safety of our technology is one of those things you need to be considering.
Yeah, absolutely. It's got to be up there too. So Sean, that's all the questions I have. I really appreciate your time today and informing us and giving us some great things to think about. So thank you very much for joining.
Thank you, Rich. I appreciate the chance to be here. Thanks to you, the Ohio State community. We appreciate the partnership, and anything that I can do to help you all, I'll do it. I just encourage everybody that's listening here to take this seriously, to step up, to express yourselves, to make it known how important security is, your privacy, your personal information, and the importance of our critical infrastructure, which, if it's not protected, is going to lead to some catastrophic incidents down the road. I know that for sure. I know what the adversaries are trying to do, and it really is reliant upon all of us to step up. So thanks for having this event, and thank you so much for inviting me.
All right. Thank you, Sean. Really appreciate it.